My relationship with my 28-year-old brother Mark has always been tense. I am 25. He is the traditional golden child, the one who, in my parents' view, could not do wrong no matter how much he screwed up. Me, usually ignored, I was the silent one. It didn't help that I developed a limp from a foolish playground accident when I was 7 years old. My right leg has changed since. Walking is okay. Everything physically taxing requires more work. Of course, Mark thought this amusing. It began with young jabs, mimicking my limp, and called me Hop-Along. I thought he would grow out of it, but as we grew older, his jokes became more brutal. The worst of all is also, my relatives dismissed it as mild teasing. "Oh, that's just Mark," they would counsel. "Don't let it get to you." Said easier than done is true. Not to feel tiny when the ones who should be supporting you make you feel as though you are exaggerating is difficult. One last family supper was a perfect illustration. Mark was in great condition and was openly joking about how I should have special accommodations for our hiking trip last year. He copied me asking for assistance on the trail, exaggerating my limp for amusement. My dad, who patted him on the behind like he had just cracked the best joke in the world, screamed at everyone at the table. With hot cheeks, I sat there acting to be enthralled by my mashed potatoes. Not the first time, and not the last either, but about that moment, something stayed with me. Perhaps it was the way my mother looked at me after laughing, perhaps challenging me to speak. Perhaps it was simply the sheer tiredness of continually serving the punchline. That evening, I stewed back in my small flat, not in mourning, but in irritation. I wasn't weak. I had created a life for me despite my handicap. I picked up swimming, tackled house improvements, and even started a strong profession in software development. Though I worked hard to be independent, my family cannot see past my limp. That evening, I realized I was going to stop letting them define me. I first gave my pal Olivia a call. For years, she has been my rock. She let go when I mentioned the dinner. She said, "You focus on you. Show them what they're missing out on. You don't need them to validate you." And that's exactly what I did. I began with a project that has been simmering in my head for some time, changing my flat to increase access. Mark had jokingly quipped that my apartment was like a handicap obstacle course. Though I despised his delivery, he was right. I turned that into a challenge. I investigated designs, acquired supplies online, and started working. I built special ramps, rearranged furniture, and even configured an automated door system over the next few weeks. It proved difficult. I spent more evenings than I would want to admit, covered in sawdust, and had to educate myself in many new skills. Still, the outcomes were well worth it. My apartment seemed really mine for the first time. I had a flash at work about the same time. Though I had been desiring it, my manager asked me to oversee a significant project, something I would not have thought I would be qualified for. Though the load was great, I sprang right forward. I received a bonus and a promotion when the project concluded satisfactorily. The cosmos seemed to be at last tossing me a bone. Of course, my family noted something seemed off. I began skipping family dinners, responding to texts less often, and avoiding Mark totally. My parents called frequently, urging me to let bygones be bygones and chat with him. But I stayed strong. I wasn't going to participate unless Mark demonstrated real transformation. All I had thus far had been a few caustic pieces on the silent treatment. Classic Mark. I discovered another community in the meantime. Something Olivia had been pushing me to attempt. I signed up for a neighborhood adaptive sports group. Although the first session was terrifying, by the end, I had befriended people who really knew what it was like to negotiate life with a disability. They were inspirational rather than only helpful. I never would have guessed I would enjoy wheelchair basketball, but I developed a talent for it. I felt as though I was creating a life unrelated to Mark or his ideas for the first time in a long time. I was proving something to myself. I was not trying to prove anything to him. Really, that felt better than anything else. That initial taste of freedom, of establishing a place genuinely mine, was seductive. The automated entrance and the ramps made a statement as much as they were useful. Ever the encouraging buddy, Olivia shared a little video of the apartment improvements on her social media page. Not much thought of it until the alerts started flooding in. People were remarking on how creative the designs were, how they might assist others facing similar difficulties. Some even sought guidance on how to make their own areas more approachable. It was strange. To be honest, a touch daunting. The best thing about it is Mark too noticed it. Typical Mark. He texted me and loaded with sarcasm. I didn't answer something about how I was milking it for pity points, and how others just cared because I was playing the victim. When I was at last starting to move forward, I was not going to allow him to drag me back into his negativity. At work, meanwhile, things were rigorous. The client was happy when we pulled off the major job, even though its deadline approached. My manager paid me a personal thank you call, informing me of the bonus and promotion. This meant I could pay for the next stage of apartment improvements without draining my reserves. Every effort seemed to be paying off at last. Naturally, my folks noted my absence. They began phoning more frequently, wondering why I hadn't responded to Mark's SMS or why I hadn't been attending Sunday dinners. One began to trip from guilt. They expected me to be the bigger person, fixing things with him. I told them I wasn't interested in acting as though everything was good, just to keep the peace. Mark had to own his treatment of me if he sought a relationship. That didn't appeal to them. They argued, but I stood firm, reminding him I wouldn't interact with him until there was actual responsibility. They hated it, but for the first time, they didn't object as forcefully. Perhaps they were beginning to notice I was not the same person who used to silently sit at the dinner table, allowing Mark's comments to flow over me. I started attending such adaptive sports group events at last about this time. To be honest, I was first anxious. Most of the people there seemed to be far more confident and seasoned than I am. Still, they were warm and supportive. They guided me, and before long I was experimenting with wheelchair basketball. As it happens, I'm not half awful. It was a rush, and I started looking forward to each session. Just as vital was the social component. I encountered others who knew what it was like to negotiate the world with a handicap. They celebrated every victory, regardless of size, and were not only encouraging. It seemed like a very different planet than what I knew from living with my family. After Olivia's video of my apartment, one of my new friends that I tell more about my path. Originally unsure, I decided to go for it when a local adaptive living group got in touch and asked me to speak at an event. Though little, the incident had significance. Speaking up there about my experiences felt empowering. People asked intelligent questions, and a couple came up later to thank me for telling my tale. Mark followed form exactly through all of this. He made a couple more caustic remarks via text, but they didn't really annoy me anymore. I didn't need his approval, and I most definitely wouldn't let his criticism trip me. A few weeks later, I took part in a local 5K adaptive race and had one of the most fulfilling experiences. Not simple. Weeks of training required me to push myself harder than I could have imagined, but I felt unbounded when I crossed the finish line. I was showing to myself that I could achieve things Mark would always have stated were impossible, not merely proving Mark incorrect. Starting to cut back on family visits, my mental health clearly improved. I still spoke with my parents once in a while, but I made it plain that I was giving myself top priority. For me, the distance worked. Encouraging colleagues and friends who sensed my potential surrounded me and pushed me on. When I look back, it is astounding how much changed in such a brief period. I used to believe Mark's view counted, and that I needed his approval to feel competent. I understand now how mistaken I was. My development spoke for itself. I didn't need his approval or that of anyone else to keep ahead. At a family BBQ, things got close. I had been dodging these events like the plague while my parents were hosting, but my mother pleaded with me to come, assuring me it would be low-key, just family. Against my better sense, I agreed. As soon as I entered, the strain was strong. As usual, Mark was in court laughing loudly at his own jokes, while my parents hovered close, attempting to keep the mood light. I stayed on the group's margins and spoke with a cousin I hadn't seen in some time. But Mark turned to see me. He made a beeline over, and without warning, started a loud tirade about how I was making everyone uncomfortable by avoiding him. He accused me of not letting things go and acting as the victim, generating drama. The backyard went quiet all around. Everybody was concentrated on something. I stayed silent. I flailed not at all. I just informed him that establishing limits was about preserving my tranquility, not about acting the victim. His surprise seemed to come from my steady voice. I didn't bite him. He muttered something about me overreacting. Turning, I left him standing before everyone and headed away. My cousin later drew me aside while I was drinking in the kitchen. She said she'd always thought his behavior over the top and praised me for challenging him. Someone in the family had finally freely admitted what I had been suffering with for years. That little validation event meant more than I could have imagined. Work was going really nicely in the meantime. For the project I oversaw, my manager suggested me for an industry award for creativity and adaptive technology. Though it seemed like a victory just getting nominated, I couldn't stop smiling when the shortlist arrived and I found my name on it. The acknowledgement gave me a boost, and soon I saw more chances becoming available. Mark could not, of course, leave it alone. Every chance he had, he began to comment passively, aggressively. Not subtle, and no one else laughed. He joked about how certain individuals were fishing for trophies instead of concentrating on what really mattered during one group text thread. Though I didn't reply, it was obvious he was trying to irritate me. The way some of the family started changing their viewpoint shocked me. A few days following the BBQ, my aunt called to see how I was doing. She said she and a few others had been chatting and agreed Mark's actions had gone too far. Though it wasn't a full-fledged family intervention, it seemed like progress. Around this time, I reached a significant fitness goal. Having trained consistently since the 5K, I at last finished a personal best in one of the adaptive sports challenges. Though it was a minor triumph, it stoked the flames. The local newspaper even noticed my tale and ran a report on my support of adapted living. It felt strange to see my picture in print with a header honoring my successes. Mark handled it normally, predictably poorly. Blowing out in our family group chat, he accused me of attempting to make him appear terrible and of wanting attention. I ignored him, but the rest of the family did not. A couple of cousins pushed back, advising him to let me have my moment and stop being so resentful. He left a string of emojis behind like some sort of dramatic departure after hurrying out of the discussion. I chose to start therapy when all of this was developing. The years of ridicule and rejection had worn on me, and I wanted to sort everything in a sensible manner. My therapist guided me in seeing how profoundly Mark's statements had ingrained themselves in my self-image. I began to let go of the notion that I required his permission, or anybody else's, to feel worthy for the first time. Inspired by this fresh viewpoint, I started organizing a solo trip, something I had been too terrified to attempt years before. Though Mark used to make fun of me for even thinking of going alone, claiming I wouldn't last a day without aid, I had always fantasized about doing so. I asked no one for opinions this time. I began looking at locations and figuring out how to make the vacation fit my circumstances. Investigating the world on my own terms seemed freeing. That was then the ultimatum. Mark claimed we couldn't go forward without sorting things out. He sent a long, rambling text demanding a face-to-face conversation to clear the air. I told him I was open to a conversation, but only if he would honor my limits and approach it with real responsibility. His response? Radio quiet. That quiet revealed a great deal. It strengthened my will to put myself first and to refuse to let his negativity control my life. I felt more focused than ever as I worked on my travel schedule and anticipated the chances just waiting for me. My existence now was about proving myself right, not about disproving him. That solitary vacation fulfilled a desire. I selected a national park with well-known accessible paths. I planned transportation, reserved an accessible cabin, and looked at renting adaptive equipment. Every stride seemed like advancement, gradually erasing the belief that I was incapable of doing anything on my own. As usual, Olivia was quite helpful. She provided doable advice on how to pack, get about a foreign city, and keep secure. She even assisted me in learning to use public transportation, something I had avoided for years due to concern about accessibility problems. I felt as ready as I could have by the time departure day arrived. Obviously, my parents were not happy. They phoned the evening before, expressing worries about me flying alone. Mark used to say, "It's too dangerous, and I should wait until I have someone to go with," and my mother kept repeating everything he said. Though I gently reassured them, I refused to allow their uncertainty to stop me. This wasn't about him or her. When the day at last arrived, I packed, quickly photographed something for social media, and left. My followers responded overwhelmingly favorably, most of whom had begun following me after Olivia's film of my apartment renovations. Messages of encouragement and success wishing arrived from those supporting me. It was a little yet significant send-off. The travel itself was incredible. Claire, another single visitor I met, was on her first solo trip and wheelchair-dependent. We clicked right away, trading tales and lending one another encouragement. I visited the area, conquered difficult paths, and even had a picture taken by a park ranger for their social media page, which attracted a lot of internet attention. Mark naturally couldn't resist weighing in with a caustic text about my self-promotion. I ignored him, concentrating instead on the compliments from friends and total strangers. By the trip's conclusion, I had exceeded all I could have imagined, something Mark had always told me I couldn't do. I negotiated a whole day of activities without any help. Every moment was evidence of my distance from the past. I sent Olivia and some friends highlights when I got home. While my parents were dubious, they were delighted for me. Though I could tell they were suppressing their uncertainty, I refrained from pushing. This was my path, not theirs. The best aspect is I didn't feel compelled, for the first time, to search my phone for Mark's or anybody else's opinions. This journey had been for me, hence the true turning point was that awareness. I had formally started to reject the story I needed affirmation from someone who never believed in me to start with. My parents insisted on a family meeting a few weeks later to sort things out. I agreed, but only under ground rules. No interruptions, no disparaging remarks, and everyone has an opportunity to speak. The gathering was strained. Mark was his usual dismissive self. When it was my turn to talk, I laid everything out exactly and straightforwardly. Using particular instances, I described how his contempt had hurt. Of course, Mark entered complete denial. He said I was too sensitive, and he never meant anything sinister. Still, my parents didn't leap to his defense for the first time. My dad really stood out, saying that perhaps Mark's jokes had gone too far. My mother seemed uncomfortable. Mark dashed out in a fury. My dad shocked me by apologizing after he departed. He acknowledged that years ago he ought to have intervened. Though it lacked complete closure, it felt like a minor triumph. Mark hardly spoke with me in the next weeks. I concentrated on treatment, strengthening my boundaries, and regaining my self-worth. My working relationship with Claire was flourishing, and I even received an invitation to address living with disabilities at a nearby school. Not every family member offered encouragement. Certain cousins whispered that I was exaggerating. I told them I was done forfeiting my serenity to make the family comfortable, not arguing. Though the tension still exists, I felt more at ease than I have in years. My life was proceeding in directions I never would have guessed. Work was rewarding, my social group was solid, and the weight of asking Mark for permission was at last gone. Though the family might have been split, for the first time I felt whole. Mark did later send a half-hearted text apology. I said that harmony would call for more than just words. His reply was, stillness. Simultaneously, the project I was working on with Claire won me an industry award for my contributions to adaptive technology. I even spoke about accessibility in a keynote at a big conference. Usually Mark made a sarcastic comment about me enjoying the spotlight, but this time, nobody laughed. My parents even informed me they supported my limits and expressed their pride discreetly. Claire and I grew great friends, and the appreciation for my art kept mounting. I even appeared in a magazine article on neighborhood activists. Mark tried once more at reconciliation, but I turned him down, explaining that regaining trust would take time and work. Though difficult, setting those limits was essential. I was more concerned with preserving my peace than I was with him anymore. Therapy had helped me realize that forgiving bad behavior did not equal endorsing it. Also, beginning changes were my parents. Wanting to better assist both their children, they started showing up for family therapy sessions. Knowing they were trying helped me to have closure. The last triumph presented itself as an exhausting adaptive marathon. Mark had once laughed at something as unattainable, but I trained for months and crossed the finish line to prove him and myself wrong. Looking back on everything, I came to see I no longer required Mark's approval or affirmation. From inside, I found my power, my successes, and peace. I felt totally free for the first time. My path was about demonstrating to myself that I was capable of anything, not about disproving my brother. Furthermore, I had Story 2. Story 2. My wife Sarah and I greeted our baby into the world last December. Sarah suffered postpartum depression and the birth was difficult. After her maternity leave, she had intended to go back to work, but her mental health made that difficult. Hoping her illness would get better, we decided to wait a year, and our kid would be a bit older. Sarah has been attending weekly treatment sessions since then. Sarah had to quit her job. Hence, I took care of all our home expenses. I had to start putting in extra time. I discussed it with Sarah before I started, and she was quite cool with it. She knew always about my working schedule. I met with my managers many weeks ago regarding a new project. Though it required a lot of overtime and was a major event, monetarily and for my career, it was an amazing chance for me. I asked Sarah about it before I dedicated myself, wanting her view. She urged me to grab it and said she was good with it. I did, and the process started a few weeks ago. Jessica, Sarah's friend, came to stay with her and assist with housework and childcare while I was working those extended hours. Since Jessica's mother of two herself, I felt at ease having her here while I was away. After around 3 weeks of hard labor, we came to see the job required more time to finish. Following that conference, I came home and told Sarah. She first declared she had no trouble with it, but her attitude toward me got frigid as the days progressed. This wasn't totally surprising given her mental state over the past few months. Hence, I didn't give it much thought and tried not to let it personally affect me. One night late, during the last week of the project, I returned home shocked to find Jessica still there. I didn't question it. I was tired. I simply greeted both of them and headed to see our daughter. I heard Jessica's voice before I got into her room. She was explaining to Sarah that it was a sign, as I hadn't stopped to properly welcome her. Uncertain, I turned back to inquire what she meant. Sarah started crying suddenly, and Jessica leaped up to accuse me of an affair. She said Sarah's despair and weight gain over the past few months had made her ugly to me. I started to get startled. It was a full misinterpretation. I never considered Sarah in that light. Keeping our heads above water financially, I was doing everything I could to help her through her despair. Regardless of how the past several months have affected her, Sarah has always been the most beautiful woman on earth. I simply wanted to allow her the time and privacy required for healing. Then, alleging it as evidence of my infidelity, Jessica insisted on seeing my cell. I denied. She read that as evidence of guilt. Angry, I assured her I had no trouble with her wanting to check my phone. Only Sarah had the right to do so. Sarah nodded, and I felt underwhelmed by her lack of confidence. She questioning me, after all, shocked me. She looked over my phone and naturally found nothing. Then Jessica began saying I had already erased everything. By now she was almost shouting, waking our daughter. Furious and disappointed, I urged Jessica to go right away. Sarah was in no shape to say anything, and Jessica finally went. I went to check on Sarah and try to clean the air after calming our kid back to sleep. She said she had been troubled since I started working so much. We had talked about it, how fantastic an opportunity it was, and she had consented to it, I reminded her. She said she thought it strange that the project had been extended. Given the nature of the work, I said, it was natural. She demanded further evidence, so I showed her all of my work emails and texts with timestamps, therefore demonstrating that I had been working all through. Having seen everything, Sarah at last believed me and apologized for questioning me. She admitted Jessica had been poisoning her mind and persuaded her everything I was doing indicated I was cheating. I advised her to have spoken with me personally about her worries, rather than believing an outsider over me. Though she couldn't exactly explain why Sarah let Jessica meddle in our personal affairs, she looked sincerely guilty for thinking poorly of me. That terrible night was a few weeks ago, and the project is at last finished. I reduced back my hours and took a little sabbatical to allow more time with Sarah and our children. To be honest, though, I feel burned out from all the work, and knowing that Sarah might never really trust me, no matter what I do, causes persistent bitterness. What will happen the next time a project like this comes up? I keep questioning myself. Alternatively, if I have to travel for business, will she naturally accuse me of cheating without even asking? She always shuts off the talks when I try to discuss it with her. She claims it's not the correct moment, or she's too tired or agitated to talk. Although I attempt to be sympathetic to her emotions, I can't help but wonder whether she will ever give mine any thought. I need some direction on what to do. Many have advised therapy. For me, this is quite sensible. I agree as well. What happened truly screwed my brain. I told Sarah a few days ago I had to visit a therapist. I said nothing about it having bearing on her claims or anything else. She only shrugged and advised me to act any way I pleased. When I got home the following day, our bedroom and my home office were utterly wrecked. Important papers were all over the floor, things thrown everywhere. Sarah wasn't home. Her phone was off. Our kid was alone in her room sobbing. When I phoned Sarah's parents and friends, none had seen her. Given her mental state, I frelled. I searched for Sarah, then invited my mother to come over and see our daughter. Sarah returned even as my mother was on her way. She turned out had been with Jessica. This came following my clear instructions to Jessica to avoid our house. Sarah arrived obviously agitated, like she had been crying. I asked her what was wrong since I worried someone had broken into the house and something had happened. She let out a blast, screaming at me, accusing me of cheating, and turning therapy into a justification for meeting my mistress. She wouldn't listen when I attempted to cool her down and explain that wasn't accurate. She then squarely and forcefully struck me. I came away with a nose cut. Sarah just sat on the couch silently after she understood what she had done. Locking the door, I proceeded to our daughter's room. After telling my mother what occurred, I phoned her mother-in-law to ask whether she may visit and look after Sarah. Our daughter's belongings were packed, and we left right away once my mother got here. Sarah asked where we were headed, but she stayed on the couch. I headed to the hospital to have my nose checked and left our baby with her grandfather and my mother. Sarah is at her parents' house right now. My daughter and I are staying with her grandparents. I'm working to obtain Jessica a restraining order. Though I love Sarah very much, we have decided to split. For our daughter, our connection now seems poisonous and maybe hazardous. I just want to separate temporarily till she receives the care she requires, so we may work things out. I am not intending to divorce her. My in-laws are thinking about admitting Sarah to a nearby hospital and accept my choice. Should things not get better, I am also being ready for the likelihood of a custody fight. I already have the required paperwork. I cannot leave our daughter under Sarah's custody in her present condition. Though I know it's for the best, it pains to see her like way. Her mental condition has taken over. It is not safe for our daughter or myself. I have to allow her time to recuperate and shield my small daughter. I also chose to document what transpired in a police report to guard my daughter. Monday morning, Sarah passed away. That day, her parents had decided to admit her to the hospital for inpatient therapy. She arrived to my parents' place the evening before and insisted I bring her our baby. I turned aside. She had hurt me, so I reminded her she had left our daughter alone for hours. I couldn't rely on her with our child. She persisted on taking her, even though I advised she spend time with our daughter at my parents' place. She was offended, but didn't dispute much when I firmly declined. Finally, she went. A few hours later, we discovered she had smashed her parents' car into a tree. Jessica dropped by my parents' place yesterday to pay her respects. She said, crying, that she wanted to speak at Sarah's funeral. She said she was merely letting me know as a courtesy. She had already mentioned it to Sarah's parents. I told her quite definitely not. We fought. Jessica charged me of never showing Sarah any care and of being disloyal. I contacted Sarah's parents when she departed, but they insisted on letting Jessica talk. They underlined that Sarah was childhood friend of Jessica and that nobody else knew Sarah better than her. With our emotional situation right now, I desire not to clash with my in-laws. It might sour ties between us, but I get nauseous thinking about having someone like Jessica, who helped to shape all this, at my wife's burial. The idea of listening to her present intolerable to me. Right now, I'm not sure if I can make the proper choice. I have been engulfed in loss, remorse, and anxiety. My parents disagree about what I should do, and I lack the energy to ask friends for guidance. Sometimes the people we thought of as loyal friends could prove to be our biggest foes. Though their behavior tells a different narrative, they may be seeming to care. Not everyone who lends a sympathetic ear for crying on really has your best interests first. One should identify who actually loves you and who might be abusing their position. Never let nasty people take advantage of your weaknesses or trust them. Let such people into your life, even if your ending isn't as sad as Sarah's, and you may find a protracted and difficult struggle results.